The breath in your lungs, the rush of memory, the sting of shame, and the electric instant of choice. What if none of it were a mystery whispered by a soul, but the work of a living machine?
Prologue: The Clock That Breathes. A face looks out from the 18th century, a physician in fur-trimmed robes, a soft cap perched on his head, eyes bright with mischief. Julien Offray de la Mettrie looks like a man who has just told a joke and is waiting to see if you'll laugh or flinch. He lived for only 41 years, but he crammed a lot into them. Medical practice, battlefield surgery, scandal, exile, and a little book that would be denounced from pulpits and burned by civic authorities. Earlier thinkers had tried to protect human specialness by drawing a sharp line. Beasts were automata. Humans were something more, unsouled, infused with a metaphysical extra that set us apart. La Mettrie took that same comparison and turned it back on us. Look closely, he said. The heartbeat, the blush of shame, the ache of grief, the sudden surge of courage, the memory of childhood, all of it unfolds in step with the state of the body. What if there is no detachable, immaterial remainder? What if a human being just is a particularly intricate, self-winding device of flesh and nerve? Wikipedia +1. This didn't feel like an abstract puzzle to him. He was a physician before he was a philosopher. In war hospitals, he watched bullets, fevers, and concussions rearrange personalities. A blow to the head could turn a careful man into someone impulsive and crude. A fever could snatch someone's reason and return it days later like a borrowed coat. Strong drink loosened tongues. Opium softened sorrow. For La Mettrie, these weren't curiosities. They were clues. If changing the machine changes the mind, maybe the mind is what the machine does. To grasp why that thought still hums beneath contemporary debates, it helps to put down the philosophy textbook and walk into a modern clinic or lab. A neurosurgeon threads an electrode into a brain, and when she switches it on, a man's tremor quiets. A psychiatrist adjusts stimulation parameters in another patient, and a crushing, treatment-resistant depression begins to lift. In a mouse lab, researchers flash light into a tiny patch of the hippocampus, and a fear memory returns as if someone pressed play. None of this proves that we are nothing but machines, but it makes it hard to imagine a mind that floats free of matter. Parkinson's Foundation, +2 nature +2. La Mettrie wrote in a world of springs, gears, and hydraulic statues. We write in a world of silicon and code, of language models and brain-wide activity maps. His clockwork duck has become our neural network. His mechanical flute player has become a robot arm guided by patterns of firing in motor cortex. The metaphor has changed, but the wager is the same. The breath in our lungs, the stories we tell, the choices we agonize over. Could all of this be the organized work of a living machine? A surgeon's wager. La Mettrie did not come to materialism by reading Democritus in a comfy chair. He trained under Hermann Boerhaave, one of Europe's most respected clinicians, and worked as a military surgeon. He spent his days touching the very stuff philosophy often abstracts away from: bones, viscera, pus, blood. When he saw minds change, it was because something in that stuff changed. A soldier takes a musket ball to the skull and wakes with a different temperament. A patient with high fever raves deliriously, and then, as the body cools, regains the thread of their life as if waking from a nightmare. A drunkard becomes sentimental, then belligerent, then unconscious, as the alcohol is absorbed, distributed, and metabolized. None of these scenes require metaphysical commentary to be medically useful, but together they nudge a thought. Perhaps the mind is not a pilot in the body, but the name we give to the organized functioning of the body itself. We now have countless modern echoes of La Mettrie's wager. Consider anesthesia. A carefully tuned mixture of drugs, delivered to the bloodstream, can silence consciousness in a matter of seconds and, with similar care, bring it back. EEG and imaging studies show large-scale shifts in coordinated brain activity as people go under and come back. Turn the knobs one way, and pain signals no longer reach awareness. Turn them another, and even the basic sense of there is a world disappears. When you wake, you don't return from some hidden immaterial place. You simply resume functioning. Or consider frontotemporal dementia, a disease that gradually damages specific parts of the frontal and temporal lobes. Patients can become disinhibited, apathetic, or strangely indifferent to social norms. Families often describe it as a person vanishing before their body does. Someone once gentle becomes cruel. Someone once responsible becomes impulsive. No one who watches this unfold up close is likely to think of the mind as an independent substance unaffected by the tissues in which it lives. Add psychopharmacology to the picture. Antidepressants that slowly lift mood over weeks by altering neuromodulators. Antipsychotics that quiet voices and delusions by dampening particular pathways. Psychedelics that, in controlled settings, can tear down rigid patterns of thought and sometimes leave behind more flexible habits. Change the chemistry, and you change the patterns of thought, perception, and value. La Mettrie's wager, then, is not a mystical leap. It is a generalization from clinical observation. If every reliable way we have of changing the mind works by changing the body, maybe the mind just is the organized activity of the body. 2. What exactly did man and machine claim? Beneath its deliberately shocking title, L'homme machine is surprisingly compact. La Mettrie advances three intertwined claims: continuity, empirical leverage, and ethical naturalism. Continuity. Humans and other animals, he argues, share a single biological plan. We differ in degree of complexity, not in metaphysical kind. There is no clean line where mere mechanism ends and soul begins. The same sorts of organs, nerves, and fluids that support sensation and movement in a dog or a bird support memory and judgment in us. We simply have more intricate arrangements of them. That was bold in his day. It is fairly tame now. Comparative neuroanatomy and genomics show overlapping toolkits across mammals and birds, similar neurotransmitters, similar synaptic machinery, variants on similar circuits. Corvids and apes, for example, solve planning and social tasks in ways so sophisticated that it takes careful experimental work to tell their performances apart. Nature +1. Empirical leverage. La Mettrie treats every covariation of mind and body as evidence. Sleep, intoxication, injury, hormonal states, each reliably bends thought and feeling. If an immaterial mind were the true locus of our decisions and desires, why would it track the condition of the body so closely, so lawfully? It would be as if a ghost, insistently independent, decided to mirror the weather of the flesh for no clear reason. A much simpler picture is that what we call mind just is the functioning of an embodied system. Modern neuroscience multiplies the examples. When a stroke knocks out a patch of visual cortex, a specific region of the visual field disappears. When a tiny seizure focus in temporal lobe is stimulated, patients may report a sudden flood of memories or an eerie sense of déjà vu. When stimulating motor cortex through an implanted grid, neurosurgeons can make a hand clench or an arm rise, sometimes accompanied by the patient's confused commentary, "I didn't mean to do that." The line between "I did it" and "it happened to me" blurs at the borders of circuitry. Ethical aftermath. Perhaps most scandalously, La Mettrie drew ethical conclusions from his view. If character and temperament are rooted in constitution and experience, then vice is more like illness than like metaphysical corruption. He leaned into a cheerful hedonism. Happiness and misery are natural states. The art of living well is the art of arranging bodies, habits, and societies so that pleasure and flourishing are more likely. He mocked austere moralists who treated suffering as a virtue, and praised those who, knowing our animal kinship, extended compassion beyond the human. You don't need to share the specifics of his ethics to see their modern resonances. Public health, social medicine, and much of contemporary criminal justice reform rest on a similar thought. If people's capacities and tendencies are shaped by genes, childhood, nutrition, pollution, trauma, and opportunity, then justice is less about damning souls and more about designing environments, institutions, and treatments. Third, why it was resisted and why it keeps coming back. Resistance to man and machine wasn't only about theology, though sermons and censorship certainly played their part. It was also about fear. Fear that a mechanistic picture of the human being would dissolve meaning, erode responsibility, and flatten our sense of dignity. Immanuel Kant, writing a generation later, admitted that empirical psychology and physiology could tell us much about how humans behave, but he wanted to ring-fence a notion of freedom and moral law that could not be reduced to causal webs. On his view, we belong to two standpoints. As appearances in nature, we are determined. As moral agents, we must regard ourselves as capable of initiating actions according to reasons. He worried that crude materialism, like crude metaphysics, would either license fatalism, I couldn't help it, my molecules made me do it, or encourage a spiritual authoritarianism, only priests understand the soul. Romantic and vitalist reactions added an aesthetic and emotional dimension to this worry. To describe a lark's song or a lover's grief as machine output felt, to many, like a category mistake, as if you'd tried to understand a tragedy by listing the chemical formulas for tears. Life, they insisted, bears a spontaneity and inwardness that can't be captured in box and arrow diagrams. Those nerves never really went away. When someone says today, you're just a machine, most of us hear diminishment. You are less than you feel yourself to be. We worry that if love and loyalty can be graphed as attachment circuits and neuromodulator dynamics, they will lose their seriousness. We worry that if aggression and cruelty can be traced to brain development and social learning, blame will evaporate. And yet the mechanistic view keeps returning, not out of philosophical stubbornness, but because it keeps generating successful predictions and interventions. When we tweak brains and bodies, minds move. When we map circuits, we gain levers. And when we simulate aspects of cognition in artificial systems, we learn that complex behavior can emerge from simple units organized in the right way. The challenge then is to hold two thoughts together: that mechanistic explanation is extraordinarily powerful, and that our lives still matter in the thick, evaluative sense. Love is still love, even if you understand its machinery. 4. From automata to architectures, today's scientific heirs. Mettrie lived at the dawn of elaborate mechanical toys. Jacques de Vaucanson's flute player and digesting duck stunned audiences in the 1730s and 1740s. Here were contraptions that seemed to breathe, to eat, to produce coordinated behavior. Their insides were all springs, valves, bellows, and gears laid bare for inspection. For many Enlightenment thinkers, they were proofs of concept. If artistry and engineering could mimic aspects of life, perhaps nature herself was a grand, self-running machine. Our analogues today aren't brass musicians and fake duck guts, but neural architectures and whole-brain activity maps. Instead of polished gears, we have matrices of synaptic weights. Instead of clockwork control rods, air pulses, and cams, we have feedback loops of excitatory and inhibitory neurons. The underlying explanatory style, identify parts, their organized interactions, and the resulting behavior has remained. The metaphors and tools have changed. Two broad families of ideas carry Mettrie's mechanistic impulse into contemporary neuroscience, global workspace theories, and predictive processing frameworks. 1. Global neuronal workspace. Global workspace theories start from a simple intuition. At any moment, a vast number of neural processes are humming away unconsciously, but only a small fraction of information makes it into the spotlight of consciousness, where it becomes accessible to many other systems: memory, language, planning, valuation. Consciousness, on this view, is what happens when some representation wins a competition for global access. The global neuronal workspace, GNW theory, fleshes this out in neural terms. It proposes a loosely distributed network of long-range pyramidal neurons, mostly in frontal and parietal cortex, that can suddenly ignite, broadcasting specific contents widely. A faint visual stimulus might be processed in early visual areas without ever reaching this workspace. A stronger or better timed stimulus might trigger a late all-or-nothing ignition, correlating with the subject's report, "I saw it. PMC +1, GNW doesn't treat the brain as a tidy clock. It models it as a dynamic, recurrent system with bottlenecks and thresholds, but its explanatory ambition echoes Mettrie's to show how the seemingly magical light going on of conscious awareness is a pattern of organized neural activity. Recently, GNW has faced direct experimental challenge in a high-profile adversarial collaboration. Proponents of GNW and a rival, Integrated Information Theory, YYT, jointly designed experiments, pre-registered their predictions, and gave a neutral consortium the job of collecting and analyzing data. The results, published in 2025, were mixed. Some findings favored aspects of IIT, others fit GNW better, and some contradicted both. Rather than producing a clear winner, the project did something more Mettrie-like. It turned vague slogans into testable, risky claims and forced theories to expose their mechanisms. PubMed +1. 2. Predictive processing and the free energy family. Predictive processing frameworks start from a different intuition. The brain is not a passive recorder of sensory inputs, but an active predictor. At multiple hierarchical levels, it generates guesses about the causes of incoming signals and updates those guesses when they're wrong. Perception becomes controlled hallucination, an internally generated model constrained but not dictated by the senses. Carl Friston's free energy principle and related models formalize this picture. Organisms minimize a quantity related to surprise or prediction error over time, keeping themselves in expected viable states. Perception, action, learning, and even some aspects of affect can all be cast as ways of minimizing this free energy. When the model is wrong and stubbornly held, overweighting prior expectations, you get hallucinations or delusions. When precision weighting goes awry at other levels, you might get anxiety, anhedonia, or movement disorders. PMC +1. Predictive processing doesn't talk about soul or machine. Its language is statistical and dynamical, priors, likelihoods, hierarchical models. Yet the spirit is the same, to explain our most intimate mental life in terms of organized information processing in matter. Recent work has even started to bridge predictive frameworks with IIT-like measures in living neuronal cultures, exploring how integrated information changes as networks learn to predict hidden causes. Arxiv. Tools whose existence vindicates the project. These theories would be empty without tools. Here, Mettrie's mechanical imagination finds descendants in electron microscopes, neuropixels probes, high-field MRI, and genetically encoded calcium indicators. International collaborations now stitch together recordings from hundreds of thousands of neurons across the brain of a mouse, performing a simple decision task, building brain-wide activity maps of choice and action. Wikipedia. Where 18th-century anatomists dissected static organs, we now can watch living networks change in real time as animals learn, sleep, or get stimulated. These instruments don't solve the mind-body problem, but they make mechanistic explanation unavoidable. 5. Free will, readiness, and the old anxiety. Nothing in Man-a-Machine annoyed readers more than its apparent assault on free will. If we are machines, are we puppets? 20th century neuroscience seemed for a while to sharpen this worry into experimental form. In the 1980s, Benjamin Libet and colleagues asked volunteers to flex a finger or wrist whenever they felt the urge, while measuring electrical activity from the scalp. They also asked subjects to report the moment they first became aware of deciding to move, using a rapidly rotating clock. Libet found a slow build-up of negative voltage, the readiness potential, beginning several hundred milliseconds before the recorded movement. Strikingly, this build-up seemed to start well before subjects reported their conscious decision. The popular gloss wrote itself, "Your brain decides before you do. Free will is a post hoc story." PMC +1. For some materialists, this looked like the final blow to dualistic fantasies. For many others, including religious critics, it looked like proof that a mechanistic outlook leads to nihilism. If our choices are just the last link in a chain of unconscious neural events, how could we be responsible? But science did not stop with Libet. In 2012, Aaron Scherger and colleagues proposed a different way to read the readiness potential. What if, they suggested, the brain is constantly accumulating random fluctuations in activity, and a movement happens when this noisy signal crosses a threshold? If you align many trials to the moment of movement and average them, you will see an apparent ramp of activity, but that ramp is an artifact of averaging, not a dedicated decision signal. On this view, the readiness potential may be less like the brain secretly deciding, and more like the hum of background noise that sometimes happens to hit the go line. PNAS +1. More recent work complicates the picture further. Some studies find that the readiness potential is weak or absent when decisions are more deliberate and reasoned. Others show that we can sometimes veto an action in the final stretch, even after early neural precursors are in play. Reviews now emphasize uncertainty. The readiness potential, whatever else it is not a simple neural signature of the death of free will. OUP Academic +1. What would Mettrie make of this? Probably two things. First, that carefully measured brain signals precede and shape our actions should not surprise a mechanist. It is what you'd expect from an embodied system. Second, drawing sweeping metaphysical conclusions from a very specific, highly constrained laboratory task, twitching a wrist when you feel like it, is unwise. The sort of freedom that matters in ordinary life is not the ability to spontaneously flex at random, but the ability to learn, deliberate, weigh reasons, keep promises, and resist some impulses in light of others. From a mechanistic standpoint, that kind of freedom is still real. It's just not metaphysically spooky. It resides in the capacities of the system, in working memory that can hold competing options online, in networks that model the likely consequences of different actions, in inhibitory control circuits that can suppress one tendency in favor of another. Damage those circuits and the person's agency is impaired. Train and scaffold them and their agency grows more robust. Responsibility, on this picture, tracks what the mechanism can in fact do in context, not some mythical power to step outside causality itself. 6. Where Mettrie was right, and where machine misleads. Mettrie was right about several big things. He was right that once you know injuries, drugs, diseases, and stimulations can reliably reshape thought and mood, the burden of proof shifts to anyone who claims that mind floats free of matter. Every time a neurosurgeon suppresses tremor or obsessive thoughts with deep brain stimulation, every time an anesthesiologist reliably turns awareness off and on, every time optogenetic activation of a tagged neuronal ensemble recalls or alters a memory in a mouse, we gain another reason to think of mind as rooted in organized physical processes. Mayo Clinic +2, Nature +2. He was right that emphasizing continuity with animals widens our circle of concern. Studies of primates, corvids, and other mammals now document forms of empathy, problem-solving, planning, and even proto-moral behavior. Ravens can pass some tests of theory of mind. Chimpanzees reconcile after fights. Elephants seem to mourn their dead. Seeing these behaviors as arising from related neural and bodily architectures doesn't cheapen human uniqueness. It situates us in a spectrum where cruelty to animals looks less like harmless domination and more like betrayal of kin. Science Direct +2, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy +2. He was right, too, about what the mechanical turn in science meant. It was not just a new set of claims, it was a new kind of explanation. To explain a phenomenon mechanistically is to show how parts and processes fit together so that the phenomenon falls out of their organized activity. This style has since powered biochemistry, molecular biology, systems neuroscience, and computational psychiatry. It is precisely because we can tell mechanistic stories about neurotransmitter systems, circuit dynamics, and plasticity that we can design drugs, therapies, and brain interventions that help. But the word machine misleads if we picture clocks and cars, rigid man-made objects with fixed parts and narrow functions. Living systems are nothing like that. They grow, repair themselves, and constantly renegotiate their boundaries with the environment. Their parts are themselves processes, proteins synthesized and degraded, synapses that strengthen and weaken, cells that divide and die. Noise is not merely a nuisance but often a resource, a way of exploring possibilities. Modern control theory and predictive processing views emphasize this difference. An organism is a self-organizing regulator, not a factory device. The body and brain continuously adjust to keep certain variables, temperature, blood sugar, social contact, even narrative coherence of the self, within workable ranges. They do so in dialogue with an environment, not in isolation. That is a richer, more accurate image than anything the word machine could suggest in Metrie's time. If we keep his core insight, mind as organized matter, but drop the misleading idea of a rigid artifact, his view becomes less crude. We are not clockwork dolls. We are open, history-saturated, self-modifying systems. 7. Why the message has been embraced. Mechanistic thinking has been widely embraced for a brutally simple reason: it works. Look at medicine. Biochemistry's reduction of bodily processes to cascades of molecules gave us insulin, antibiotics, and antiviral drugs. Electrophysiology's characterization of action potentials and synaptic transmission helped us understand arrhythmias, seizures, and neuromuscular diseases. Molecular biology's unraveling of gene expression laid foundations for gene therapies and cancer treatments. None of these successes required answering, "What is it like to be a cell?" They required mapping mechanisms. Neuroscience too has cashed out the mechanistic bet. Deep brain stimulation, DBS, thin electrodes implanted into specific brain regions and connected to a pacemaker-like device in the chest, can dramatically reduce tremor and motor rigidity in Parkinson's disease when medications fail. More recently, DBS has been adapted and experimentally extended to conditions such as obsessive-compulsive disorder and severe treatment-resistant depression, with promising results in some patients. Nature +3 Parkinson's Foundation, +3 Cleveland Clinic +3. The technology keeps evolving. Adaptive DBS systems now sense neural activity in real time and adjust stimulation accordingly, reducing side effects and saving battery power by delivering pulses only when pathological patterns arise. Regulatory agencies have begun approving such brain pacemakers for Parkinson's symptoms, and clinical centers around the world are starting to perform these surgeries. Stanford Medicine +2 Reuters +2. At the non-invasive end, focused ultrasound devices, ultrasound helmets, can steer acoustic energy through the skull to modulate activity in tiny, deep brain targets without opening the head at all. Early studies suggest that such tools might offer new ways to treat movement disorders, chronic pain, and possibly even some psychiatric conditions. The Guardian. In animal research, optogenetics and chemogenetics let scientists turn genetically targeted neurons on or off with light or designer drugs. Experiments have shown that reactivating specific engram cells in the hippocampus can recall a fear memory, and manipulating such ensembles can even implant hybrid or false memories in mice. These are not mind control gadgets out of a dystopian novel. They are tightly constrained interventions on tiny clusters of cells in rodents. But conceptually, they vindicate Mettrie's hunch. Specific patterns of organized neural activity underwrite specific experiential and behavioral states. Science Direct +3 PubMed +3 PMC +3. Beyond the clinic, mechanistic thinking guides artificial intelligence. Starting from simple neuron-like units that sum weighted inputs and pass them through nonlinear functions, engineers have built deep networks that recognize faces, translate languages, and drive cars. Transformer-based language models learn to generate coherent text by adjusting billions of parameters through gradient descent. They do not understand in the way we do, and whether they are conscious is a separate, hotly contested question. But their success shows that patterns of connection and update rules can yield behaviors we used to reserve for minds. That is exactly the sort of lesson Mettrie wanted us to absorb. Complexity and organization matter more than mysterious essences. Even within AI research, global workspace and predictive ideas find new life. Some architectures explicitly implement a kind of shared workspace where different specialist modules send and receive information through a bottleneck inspired by GNW. Others use predictive coding like loss functions and hierarchies. These cross-pollinations make Mettrie's 18th-century dream, understanding mind well enough to build mind-like systems, feel less like fantasy and more like a long-term engineering problem. ArcSiv +1. 8. Why the message has been resisted. And yet, the pushback. Mechanistic pictures of the human being have not been welcomed everywhere, and not only because they threaten religious doctrines. On the moral front, critics worry that if we view criminals, say, as malfunctioning machines, our responses will be cold and technocratic. We might protect ourselves, perhaps, but not truly hold anyone responsible. Victim suffering could be minimized as a statistical outcome. Perpetrators might be reprogrammed without being confronted as persons. On the existential front, many people feel that a purely mechanistic story leaves out something crucial about lived experience: the sense of being a subject, of mattering, of standing in webs of meaning. that are not captured by diagrams of synapses. Phenomenologists and existentialists throughout the 20th century insisted that first-person experience has structures and norms that can't simply be read off from neuronal spikes. On the scientific front, there's a subtler concern. Reductionism can be premature. You can in principle describe an ecosystem purely in terms of the positions and momenta of its molecules, but you will miss the level at which predator, prey, niche, and food web live. Likewise, trying to understand depression solely as a serotonin problem or a hyperactive amygdala problem misses social isolation, poverty, trauma, and cultural scripting. Mechanistic models are most powerful when they are explicitly multi-level, connecting molecular, cellular, circuit, organismal, and social dynamics, rather than pretending one level can explain everything. Thoughtful defenders of mechanistic explanation acknowledge this. The aim is not to replace stories about love, injustice, or courage with synaptic bookkeeping, but to show how those higher-level patterns are realized and constrained in material systems. Understanding the mechanism can support, rather than undercut, our efforts to change the larger patterns. A legal system that takes seriously how impulse control and empathy actually work in the brain is better positioned to design fair sentences and effective rehabilitation, not worse. 9. A guided tour through Mettrie with 21st century lights. Reading Mettrie today can feel like leafing through an old anatomical atlas with the lights of modern neuroscience shining over your shoulder. Many of his examples are dated, but the argumentative moves remain surprisingly fresh. He begins, characteristically, with development. Watch an embryo, he says. You see a gradual organization of tissues and functions, from simple forms to differentiated organs, from primitive movements to coordinated behavior. For him, this supports continuity between the physical and the mental. The same growing body that forms lungs and liver also forms the structures that make thought possible. Today, developmental biology fills in elaborate detail. We know about gene regulatory networks, morphogen gradients, and activity-dependent wiring. We can see how patterns of gene expression and cellular signaling in the fetal brain lay out rough maps of future cortical areas, and how spontaneous neural activity before birth helps refine those maps. In some conditions, a single mutation or chromosomal change can profoundly alter cognitive trajectory, again underscoring how mental capacities grow out of physical development, not alongside it. Mettrie also dwells on animal behavior. He lists imitative birds and learned apes to mock the idea that humans alone have real minds. Modern animal cognition research repays his confidence with interest. Scrub jays remember where they cached food and what will spoil first, suggesting episodic-like memory. Ravens and great apes perform similarly on some tests of physical and social reasoning. Monkeys and apes can track what others see or know in controlled experiments, hinting at primitive theory of mind. Even some fish and birds pass mirror self-recognition tests once thought to be the exclusive badge of great apes. Nature +2, Springer Link +2. Most vivid in Mettrie are the medical vignettes: wine loosening reason, fever deranging thought, sleep knitting the body back together. Each anecdote ties a change in bodily state to a change in mental state. Our 21st century version of these stories includes anesthesia, psychoactive drugs, neurostimulation, and hormone therapies. Brain stimulation of certain frontolimbic circuits can alleviate depressive symptoms in some patients who have failed multiple other treatments. Anesthetic drugs disrupt large-scale workspace dynamics. Postpartum hormonal shifts can tip some new parents into debilitating mood disorders. The through line is clear: tweak the physiology and the person's experiential world shifts. Mettrie's ethical reflections, especially in his later writings, anticipate modern debates in neuroethics and moral psychology. If character flows from constitution and upbringing, he suggests, then retribution should give way to prevention and rehabilitation. Criminality is a misfortune to be understood and remedied, not a stain to be hated. Today, similar themes appear in discussions about addiction as a brain disease influenced by environment, about juvenile offenders whose control systems are still developing, and about social determinants of health. X, the machine today, architectures that learn and feel. In the 18th century, Calling a human a machine conjured up images of clocks, automata, and hydraulic fountains that leapt to life at the pull of a lever. In the 21st century, the metaphor shifts to architectures and algorithms. Workspace theories of consciousness now talk about recurrent networks, ignition dynamics, and bottlenecked broadcasting. Predictive processing theories talk about hierarchical generative models and Bayesian updates. Computational psychiatry tries to model delusion as misweighted prediction errors or overly rigid priors. Meanwhile, AI researchers build systems that, while not conscious, implement analogous ideas in silicon, shared attention bottlenecks, memory modules, routing networks. On the biological side, some theorists propose multi-layer frameworks where thought seeds, coherent packets of activity embodying goals or concepts, compete for dominance in a neural global workspace, echoing Mettre's sense that ideas are not free-floating ghosts, but patterns in matter. Arxiv. On the artificial side, transformer-based models use attention mechanisms to let different tokens of information influence one another across long sequences. Some architectures build an explicit global memory or scratchpad where different specialist modules write and read, inspired by global workspace theories. Others design continual learning agents whose internal representations are protected and routed in ways reminiscent of cognitive control. Arxiv +1. These parallels don't prove that brains and AI systems do the same thing, but they suggest that certain organizational patterns, global broadcast, hierarchical prediction, competition, and selection among candidate states, are powerful ways for any information processing system to manage a complex world. Mettre's bold claim that if we really understood the organization of the human body, we could, in principle, build something similar, has aged into a live engineering research program. 11. Why man-machine matters now. Why reread a scandalous pamphlet from 1747 in an era of fMRI scanners, adaptive DBS, and foundation models? First, because it names a live bet. The central question in consciousness science is no longer can matter give rise to mind. Very few working scientists doubt that it can, but what organizational forms of matter do so, and how can we tell? Mettre's willingness to follow mechanisms wherever they lead, even when they unsettle cherished beliefs, is the ethos behind large adversarial collaborations and open data projects in consciousness research. Instead of defending a doctrine, you build a model, derive predictions, and invite others to try to break it. PubMed +1. Second, man-machine helps relocate dignity. If we are organized animals, not ensouled exceptions, then what is dignified in us is not an immaterial spark but the capacities we actually exercise, to learn, to love, to keep promises, to forgive, to reshape our environment so that others can flourish. These are all things that an embodied mechanistic creature can in principle do and do better with support. A humanism that rests on ghostly substances is fragile. A humanism that rests on the extraordinary abilities of warm, wet, self-organizing systems is sturdy enough for the ICU and the courtroom. Third, the book complicates how we talk about AI. As debates rage about whether advanced language models understand, or whether future systems might be conscious, Man-Machine invites a cooler question. What exactly would an artificial system have to be like, architecturally, dynamically, to support the kinds of experiences we care about? The focus shifts from labels, is it really conscious, to mechanisms. Can it integrate information in the right way, model itself, sustain unified dynamics over time? In that sense, Mettre's legacy is method, not slogan. 12. Why the message drew fire and will again. Even among fellow Enlightenment thinkers, Mettrie was too much. He was too frank about pleasure, too explicit in denying an immortal soul, too willing to laugh at solemnities. It wasn't only priests who disliked him. Some philosophers saw him as an embarrassment, a man whose colourful rhetoric might bring censorship down on more cautious projects. Their anxiety was not entirely misplaced. Societies do run on shared stories about desert, dignity, destiny. If you tell people abruptly and crudely, you are just machines, they may hear, nothing really matters, or no one is really to blame, or love is fake. The challenge is to communicate a mechanistic understanding in a way that preserves and deepens our commitment to justice, solidarity, and care. Interestingly, the long arc since La Mettrie suggests that mechanistic medicine and materialist psychology have often strengthened rather than weakened humane concern. As diseases once seen as punishments from God, epilepsy, syphilis, psychosis, came to be understood as matters of infection, development, or circuitry, stigmas softened. Public health campaigns, social safety nets, and rehabilitative justice systems emerged not from belief in immortal souls, but from the recognition that suffering bodies and brains can be helped. We can expect similar tensions to recur as neurotechnology advances. If a future legal system can read out some coarse measures of a defendant's brain states, or if future therapies can dampen aggressive impulses more effectively, debates about autonomy, consent, and control will intensify. Some will fear a slide into technocratic manipulation, others will see new tools for preventing harm. La Mettrie's fundamental provocation, that we are organized matter, will keep drawing fire because it pushes us to renegotiate what we owe each other. Coda, the laugh of Democritus. In one famous engraving, La Mettrie is portrayed as Democritus, the laughing philosopher. The laughter isn't cruel, it's the laughter of someone who finds grandeur in the ordinary rather than in supernatural add-ons. The world is full, he seems to say. Matter organizes itself into cells, tissues, brains, and finally into creatures who can write books, argue about freedom, design experiments, fall in love, and build machines that model their own minds. On this view, meaning doesn't descend from elsewhere. It emerges when these fragile, self-maintaining systems, us, care about one another, build institutions, tell stories, and repair what breaks. There is no safety net beneath the machinery, no immortal warranty. The responsibility to keep things running, to mend bodies, nurture children, maintain just institutions, heal ecosystems, falls on us. If that is machine talk, it is not the talk of a cold, heartless engineer. It is the recognition that when mechanisms become capable of joy, grief, understanding, and solidarity, they also become capable of caring for themselves and for each other. That is the kind of clockwork breath La Mettrie wanted us to notice, not a wind-up toy, but a self-winding animal that can learn, remember, change its course, and laugh.